She boarded quietly, dressed in plain clothes, and took her seat in first class without saying a word. But the flight attendant didn't like the way she looked, and decided to make an example out of her. What no one realized was that the woman she was mocking held more power than anyone else on that flight. One call, and everything changed. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you never miss the next one. The soft hum of the cabin wrapped around the passengers like a quiet curtain. First class was nearly full, and everything gleamed. White leather seats reflected the overhead lights, and chilled glasses clinked gently on golden tray tables. Attendants moved smoothly between rows, offering drinks and folded towels with tight smiles. Most passengers barely looked up. They were used to this kind of treatment, silent, efficient, expensive. Near the third row, a black woman sat by the window. Her posture was composed, shoulders relaxed, gaze steady. She wore a fitted blazer over a plain gray shirt and dark jeans. A silver badge clipped just inside her open lapel caught the light for a moment before disappearing again as she adjusted her seatbelt. Her name was Vanessa Brooks, though no one had bothered to ask yet. She wasn't loud. She wasn't making a scene. She had simply taken her assigned seat, placed her phone on the tray table, and waited. That's when the flight attendant, Rachel Miller, appeared. She walked down the aisle with practiced steps, her heels clicking against the carpet. Her uniform was flawless, her blonde hair tucked neatly behind one ear. But there was tension in her face, something sharp in her eyes that narrowed the moment she saw Vanessa. Rachel stopped just beside the seat and looked down. "I'm going to ask you again," she said, her voice clipped but loud enough for heads to turn. "This seat isn't yours. You'll need to move to the back." Vanessa turned her head slowly, her expression calm. "I've already shown you my boarding pass," she said, her voice even. "This is my seat." Rachel smiled tightly, but it didn't reach her eyes. "We don't make mistakes with seating in first class. If you don't move, I'll have to involve security." Across the aisle, Charles Whitman, a middle-aged businessman in a navy suit, glanced over his newspaper, frowning slightly. In the front row, Eleanor Price, a retired arts professor with a pearl necklace and an oversized hat, leaned toward her husband and whispered something behind her hand. The energy shifted. It was subtle, but it spread quickly. Vanessa didn't flinch. "You can involve whoever you like," she said, resting her hands on her lap. "I'm not moving." Rachel stiffened. "We have rules for a reason. First class is reserved for premium clients." "I am a premium client," Vanessa replied, still not raising her voice. Behind Rachel, a younger flight attendant hovered uncertainly. Her name was Brooke Jensen, and she was new. Her eyes darted from Vanessa to Rachel, then to the manifest in her hand. She looked like she wanted to speak, but Rachel shot her a quick glare and Brooke shrank back. Rachel took a step forward, placing one hand on the seat in front of Vanessa. "You can either cooperate, or I'll have you removed before we leave the ground." Vanessa leaned back slightly. "I'd be careful if I were you," she said softly, not as a threat but as a fact. Then she picked up her phone and tapped once. She didn't say a word. Just set the phone down again on the tray. Rachel let out a cold laugh and turned to Brooke. "Escort her to the back." Brooke hesitated. Her hand trembled slightly as she took a step forward, but she didn't speak. Rachel's eyes narrowed again. "Now." The tension thickened. Charles folded his newspaper and watched quietly. Eleanor adjusted her seatbelt and stared straight ahead, lips pursed. Vanessa didn't move. Her voice remained calm. "You're about to make a very big mistake." No one knew what that meant yet. But in the silence that followed, the cabin began to feel colder. Rachel crossed her arms, standing her ground. Brooke stood frozen. Vanessa stayed seated, quiet, composed. The flight hadn't even taken off, but the turbulence had already begun. Rachel's lips pressed into a thin line as she stared at Vanessa, who sat calmly, unaffected by the rising tension. The silence stretched. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The engine's soft hum was the only sound for a moment. until the clinking of a glass broke the quiet from the row behind. Brooke still hadn't moved. She glanced once more at the manifest in her hand, her finger hovering over a name halfway down the list. Her instincts were screaming that something wasn't right, but Rachel's authority loomed too heavy to ignore. With one last glance at Vanessa, Brooke took a step back instead of forward. Rachel noticed. "What are you doing?" she snapped. Maybe we should double-check the list," Brooke said hesitantly. "I've already checked it," Rachel barked. "She doesn't belong here. This is first class. She either moves or gets escorted off this flight." Charles leaned forward slightly in his seat. "Excuse me," he said in a calm, firm tone. "She said she showed her boarding pass. Maybe you should check again, just to avoid any mistake." Rachel turned to him sharply. "Sir, I'd appreciate it if you didn't interfere." He leaned back but kept his gaze on her. "Just seems like a lot of noise over a seat." Rachel ignored him and turned back to Vanessa. "Last warning." Vanessa didn't even blink. "You're not listening," she said quietly. "You're only assuming." Rachel's face flushed. She wasn't used to being challenged like this, especially not by someone she'd already decided didn't belong in the luxury section. She gestured toward the back of the plane. "That's where you're supposed to be." Vanessa's expression didn't change. She didn't argue. She didn't explain. Her hands remained in her lap, her phone still resting beside her on the tray. "You're wrong," she said, as steady as before. The socialite across the aisle, Delilah Shaw, a woman who thrived on drama and whispers, leaned toward her husband. "She's trying to sneak a free upgrade," she muttered, not quietly enough. Rachel heard it. A small smirk flickered across her lips. "That's exactly what it looks like," she said to the cabin, as if fishing for approval. "Some people think the rules don't apply to them." A few passengers exchanged glances. Some looked down. Others watched with unease. Still, Vanessa didn't react. She just looked up at Rachel with the same calm eyes and said again, "You're making a mistake." Rachel didn't care. "Brooke," she said sharply, "get security on standby." Brooke hesitated for one more beat, then slowly walked toward the front of the plane, her face pale. She didn't pick up the phone. Instead, she disappeared behind the curtain near the cockpit, biting her lip the entire way. Rachel folded her arms and stood by Vanessa's seat like a soldier guarding a checkpoint. She didn't move. She didn't speak. But her presence said everything. The cabin was quiet again, but now the silence felt dangerous. And Vanessa. She simply looked forward, still as stone, patient as if she'd been through this before. The plane hadn't even pushed back yet, but the damage was already beginning to spread. A few minutes passed, slow and heavy, each second thick with discomfort. Rachel stood firm in the aisle, arms crossed, chin slightly raised, like she had already won something. Vanessa remained still, her breathing calm, her gaze resting ahead without blinking. She didn't fidget. She didn't look away. Her phone remained untouched beside her, screen dark. Whatever message she had sent earlier still lingered in the air like a silent warning. Brooke returned quietly from the front of the plane. Her steps were small, almost reluctant. She didn't speak as she walked past Rachel, but her face had changed. Something in her expression had shifted. She looked unsettled. As she passed Charles, he gave her a questioning look. She didn't meet his eyes. Rachel caught her by the arm as she passed. "Is security on standby?" she whispered. Brooke hesitated, then nodded once, though her lips stayed pressed in a thin, nervous line. "Good," Rachel said, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Let's get this over with." Vanessa shifted slightly, crossing one leg over the other. "Still pushing forward, even when you know something feels wrong," she said. "Not as a threat, but as an observation." Rachel tilted her head. "What feels wrong is someone ignoring clear rules and sitting where they don't belong." Vanessa's eyes finally met hers again. "I don't break rules. I enforce them." The sentence hung in the air, quiet but heavy. Rachel blinked, thrown for a half second, but quickly masked it with a tight smile. Delilah, the socialite, leaned toward the aisle again. She's being so difficult, why not just move, honestly? Her husband, Edward, nodded, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to say more. I'm not moving because I don't have to, Vanessa replied, not turning her head. And no one should be expected to move just to make someone else comfortable with their own prejudice. Rachel narrowed her eyes. Prejudice? Don't make this about race. Charles stood up suddenly, slow and controlled. But isn't it, he said, looking directly at Rachel. Because I boarded after her and no one asked me a thing. Now the cabin was fully quiet. Even Delilah had nothing to add. Rachel's voice rose. Sir, this doesn't concern you. It concerns all of us, Charles said. We're sitting in the same cabin, we're all witnesses now. Rachel turned away from him quickly, jaw tight. She stepped toward Vanessa again. Either you move, or you'll be escorted out. Vanessa glanced down at her phone and tapped it once. No words, just a calm, deliberate motion. Then she looked back up. You'll want to think very carefully before touching me, she said, her voice even softer now, but every syllable clear. Rachel didn't respond. She backed away half a step, unsure why, but something in Vanessa's tone, in the way she didn't raise her voice or explain herself, sent a chill up her spine. Passengers were no longer whispering. They were watching. The mood in the cabin had changed again. The balance of power had started to shift. And Rachel, for the first time, could feel it. Rachel tried to maintain her composure, but a flicker of doubt had started to crawl under her skin. She straightened her shoulders and looked around, expecting support from the cabin. But now, the atmosphere had shifted. The stares that once held confusion now carried judgment. The whispers had stopped. Eyes locked on her, not Vanessa. Vanessa didn't need to speak anymore. Her silence was louder than anything Rachel had said. The phone sat there on the tray, untouched, unmoving, but it felt like a ticking clock. Rachel's mind raced. Who had she called? What was coming? Brooke stood by the galley, holding the manifest tightly, her knuckles white. Her eyes kept darting to Vanessa, then to Rachel, and back again. She seemed caught between fear and conscience. Rachel's voice cracked slightly as she tried again, aiming to recover her control. This is your last chance, she said. Move now, or I'll have you removed before we leave the ground. Vanessa didn't even blink. Do what you need to do, she said in the same tone she'd used from the start. But remember, you're the one choosing this. Rachel turned away sharply, frustration boiling over. She walked toward the front, nearly bumping into Brooke. Where's the pilot? She snapped. He's still in the cockpit, Brooke said softly, avoiding eye contact. Then tell him we've got a passenger refusing to comply. We need her off the plane. Brooke didn't move. She stood there, frozen. Rachel's voice grew harsher. Go! Reluctantly, Brooke disappeared behind the cockpit curtain, her hands shaking slightly. Back in her seat, Vanessa stayed motionless. Her eyes drifted across the cabin. Charles gave her a respectful nod. A few others now shifted awkwardly in their seats, realizing the situation wasn't what it had first seemed. Even Delilah had started looking more uncomfortable than amused. Moments later, the cockpit door opened. The pilot stepped out, a tall man in his 50s with graying hair and a serious face. He scanned the cabin, confusion on his face. He looked at Rachel. What's going on? He asked, keeping his voice low but firm. She's refusing to move, Rachel said quickly. She's in the wrong seat. She doesn't belong in first class. The pilot turned to Vanessa, who calmly met his gaze. Ma'am, he said carefully, do you have your boarding pass? Vanessa nodded. Without a word, she reached into her inside pocket and handed it over. The pilot took a quick look. His eyes flicked to her name. Then he looked again. His expression changed. He took one slow breath, looked at Rachel, and then said quietly, I need a word with you. Now. Rachel's smile froze. Is there a problem? She asked. The pilot didn't answer. He turned and walked back toward the cockpit, holding the boarding pass in his hand. Rachel followed, her steps much slower than before. The cabin remained silent. Everyone knew something was about to happen, something big. Vanessa leaned back in her seat again, calm as ever. The phone still rested on the tray table, and Rachel, now behind the curtain, had no idea what was waiting on the other side. Inside the cockpit, the pilot stood with the door closed behind him, staring at the boarding pass. Rachel stood opposite him, arms crossed tightly across her chest, her jaw tense. "What is this about?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. He didn't look up right away. "Do you know who she is?" he asked flatly. Rachel frowned. "She said she's a passenger. That seat doesn't belong to her." He finally lifted his eyes. "Her name is on the list. In fact, she's not just any passenger. She's on a flagged list, VIP. She's with law enforcement." Rachel blinked. Law enforcement. Internal affairs. Internal affairs. Assigned to aviation security oversight. Rachel's stomach dropped. "You've got to be kidding." The pilot's voice lowered further. "This is coming from very high up. I just got a direct message from airline security. Someone made a call." Rachel's mouth went dry. She tried to hide it with another tight smile. "Maybe she's faking it." The pilot didn't respond to that. He handed the boarding pass back to her slowly. "Go apologize, and if you're smart, keep it short. The situation is already bigger than you think." Back in the cabin, the atmosphere was heavy with anticipation. Vanessa sat still, watching the curtain. Charles, Delilah, and nearly every other passenger kept glancing toward the front, waiting for something to break. Brooke had returned to the galley but kept close to the aisle, chewing her lip. The curtain finally moved, and Rachel stepped out. Her eyes scanned the cabin, and it was clear to everyone her confidence had cracked. She wasn't marching anymore. Her steps were slower, more hesitant. Her eyes avoided Vanessa's as she approached the seat. When she reached the row, she stopped but didn't speak right away. Vanessa turned to her, eyebrows slightly raised. Rachel opened her mouth, then closed it. Finally, she forced the words out. "I may have misunderstood." The apology didn't sound sincere. It barely qualified as an apology at all. Vanessa didn't smile, she didn't gloat. She simply said, "You didn't misunderstand. You assumed." Rachel's face turned pale. The silence that followed was worse than any shouting match. It wrapped around her like a judgment she couldn't escape. She turned away without another word and walked briskly toward the back of the cabin. Delilah leaned over and whispered, "She just folded." Charles, still watching quietly, nodded once. That's what happens when power meets truth. Vanessa leaned her head back and looked out the window. The tension in the cabin didn't ease. It thickened. Everyone could feel it. Because this wasn't the end. Not yet. Rachel disappeared toward the rear of the plane, her step stiff and her back straighter than necessary, like she was forcing herself to keep control. But her face, flushed and tense, told a different story. She had lost the room, and she knew it. Not a single passenger met her eyes as she passed. Brooke lingered near the front, her eyes still on Vanessa. When their eyes met for a brief moment, Brooke gave a slight nod. Just enough to say, "I see you." Vanessa returned it with the smallest tilt of her head. The pilot remained at the front, speaking softly with the co-pilot through the door. Then he stepped out again, cleared his throat, and addressed the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be experiencing a slight delay as we complete a final check. We appreciate your patience." No one responded. Most people weren't thinking about delays anymore. They were watching Vanessa. Delilah sat rigid in her seat, the tip of her manicured finger tapping against her champagne glass. Edward, beside her, had long since put his phone down and was now glancing nervously toward the front every few seconds. Charles was still seated calmly, but now he looked less like a businessman on a casual flight and more like someone waiting for a verdict. Vanessa didn't move. She remained in her seat, eyes forward, hands folded. She didn't reach for her phone again. She didn't speak to anyone. But the weight of her silence filled the cabin more than any outburst could have. 10 minutes passed. Tension crept back into the space like fog, Then came the sound that changed everything. The sudden click of hard shoes against the jetway and the sharp knock on the cabin door. Heads turned as the pilot moved quickly to unlock it. The door opened, and 2 uniformed security officers stepped inside. Not airport staff. These were federal agents. Dark suits, earpieces, serious faces. They scanned the cabin quickly and nodded toward the pilot. Rachel reappeared at that moment from the rear galley, just in time to see them enter. Her face drained of all color. One of the officers spoke to the pilot in a low voice. The other turned to the cabin, then looked directly at Rachel. "Ms. Miller?" Rachel didn't respond right away. Her eyes flicked to Vanessa, then to Brooke, then back to the officer. He stepped forward. "We need a word with you now." The cabin froze. Passengers turned to each other, shocked. Vanessa still didn't move. Rachel looked around one last time, searching for someone to defend her. Someone to say, "This isn't fair, it's a misunderstanding, she didn't mean it." No one said a word. And in that silence, Rachel finally understood. This wasn't just about a seat anymore. It never was. Rachel's throat tightened as she took a single step back. Her hands twitched by her sides, unsure of what to do. The officer standing in the aisle remained still, expression unreadable, but his tone left no room for interpretation. "We can do this here or in private. Your choice." She looked toward the galley, then the cockpit, as if an escape might appear from somewhere. When none did, she nodded stiffly and followed the agents toward the front. The entire cabin watched as she passed by. No longer the composed authority figure she had been only minutes earlier. Her walk, once sharp and confident, now looked more like a quiet retreat. Shoulders rigid, jaw clenched, eyes downward. Brooke stood aside as they walked by, her eyes wide, her hand still gripping the passenger list like it was the only thing keeping her steady. Vanessa remained in her seat, unmoved. But for the first time, she glanced around at the other passengers. Her eyes met Charles's. He gave her the smallest nod of recognition. Delilah, now visibly uncomfortable, shifted in her seat and picked up her phone, pretending to check a message, though her hand was trembling slightly. No one was speaking, yet the silence was louder than any conversation. The entire plane felt suspended in one collective breath. Inside the cockpit area, the discussion between Rachel and the agents wasn't loud enough to be heard, but it didn't need to be. The energy said enough. The way Rachel gestured, the way her face went pale, the way her shoulders sank a little lower every time someone else spoke. Even from the cabin, it was clear. This wasn't a formality. This was a reckoning. After several minutes, the pilot stepped back into the cabin. His expression was calm but serious. "Thank you for your patience," he said evenly. "We'll be making a brief landing to address a personnel issue before continuing our flight. Please remain seated until further notice." A murmur rippled through the cabin, not panic, but disbelief. Charles let out a low whistle under his breath. Delilah turned to Edward. "Are they actually landing the plane for this?" Edward shook his head slowly. "They are. She's someone important." Delilah frowned. But she didn't say anything. "She didn't need to," he replied. Rachel reemerged a moment later, flanked by the officers. Her eyes were red now, but she didn't speak. Her hands were clenched into fists at her sides. As they guided her slowly through the cabin, no one clapped. No one cheered. But the silence, that same thick, wordless silence, carried more weight than any applause. She didn't look at anyone. Not Brooke. Not the passengers. And especially not Vanessa. Vanessa didn't move. She watched Rachel pass, but her expression didn't change. Her hands remained folded, her face unreadable, her presence unshaken. When the agents and Rachel disappeared down the jet bridge, the silence lingered like a shadow. Only the gentle hum of the engines and the low static from the intercom gave life to the stillness. Brooke finally exhaled, her posture easing just slightly. She stepped closer to Vanessa's row, paused, and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for staying calm." Vanessa looked up. "It's not the first time," she said, "but it might be the last for her." Brooke didn't respond right away. Then she nodded. She made it personal. You didn't. Vanessa tilted her head slightly. Because I knew it was never about me. It was about what she thought I represented. Brooke lowered her gaze. I should have spoken up sooner. Vanessa's voice was steady. You still can. The aircraft began to move again, slowly backing away from the gate. The passengers settled back into their seats, but none of them felt quite the same. Something had shifted. And though Vanessa didn't say it, every person on board understood now. This wasn't just a confrontation. It was a lesson, and the story wasn't over yet. The plane taxied down the runway slowly, almost cautiously, as if the metal beast itself was aware that the atmosphere inside had changed. The murmurs had quieted. Passengers no longer looked out the windows with idle interest or fiddled with their seat controls. They were still processing what had happened, what they had witnessed, and what it revealed about the people around them. Vanessa sat silently in her seat, eyes closed for a moment, breathing steady. She wasn't trying to look calm. She was calm. Her silence wasn't for effect. It was rest. The type of rest only someone used to standing firm could understand. The confrontation had passed, but her presence still anchored the entire cabin. Across the aisle, Charles had finally put down his newspaper for good. His gaze rested on the aisle, but his mind was elsewhere. He glanced once more at Vanessa, thoughtful. Then he reached under his seat and retrieved his laptop, but he didn't open it. He sat with it closed on his lap, as if unsure how to return to his normal world after what had just taken place. Toward the back, Delilah sat unnaturally still, her fingers fidgeting with her bracelet. She wasn't gossiping now. Edward leaned toward her, whispering, "You know she never raised her voice once." Delilah nodded faintly. I kept waiting for her to snap back. She didn't need to, he replied. The seatbelt light flicked on, but not a single passenger shifted in their seat. All eyes seemed to remain subtly drawn to Vanessa. She didn't speak, but her presence continued to speak volumes. Then, after a few quiet minutes, the intercom crackled again. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. Due to recent developments on board, we'll be making an unscheduled stop. A ground team is already on standby. We'll resume our journey shortly after crew transition is completed. Thank you for your understanding. Crew transition. The words landed like a soft but unmistakable blow. Rachel was officially gone. Everyone knew it. No need for dramatic announcements or apologies over the speakers. The silence following those two simple words said it all. Brooke, still near the galley, swallowed hard. Her grip on the manifest had finally loosened. She approached Vanessa's row slowly, this time without hesitation. I didn't check when I should have, she admitted, eyes down. I knew something felt wrong, but I froze. Vanessa opened her eyes. Fear makes people hesitate. Integrity makes them act anyway. Brooke nodded. I didn't act fast enough. You acted before it was too late, Vanessa said gently. That's what matters. Brooke took a breath, steadier now. They're sending someone new from ground staff. Until then, the crew's down one lead. I can help, but I've never done it alone. You won't be alone, Vanessa said calmly, and something in her tone made Brooke stand taller. Behind them, whispers resumed, soft and different, not judgmental, not dismissive. This time they carried curiosity, respect, quiet reflection. One row behind, a teenager leaned toward his mother. Is she really a cop? His mother nodded. More than that, I think. The plane slowly pulled toward a private gate. Outside, a sleek black SUV had already parked at the edge of the tarmac. Two sharply dressed individuals in plain clothes stood near it, watching the plane carefully. One of them held a clipboard. The other had an earpiece. The aircraft door opened with a hiss. Cool air rushed into the cabin, brushing against the tense stillness like a fresh wind. The new staff member stepped on board with authority but not arrogance. He walked directly to the captain, exchanged a few quiet words, and then approached Vanessa. Ms. Brooks? He asked, voice respectful. Vanessa stood slowly. Yes. My team's been briefed. You're clear to continue your observation and your report has already reached corporate. He paused, then added, Thank you for handling it the way you did. Vanessa didn't smile, but she nodded. I'm not here to punish anyone. I'm here to make sure the ones who should be punished finally are. The staff member stepped aside to let her pass, but Vanessa didn't leave the plane. She returned to her seat and sat back down, calmly, deliberately. Where are you going? Brooke asked quietly. I'm staying, she replied. I'm not finished. That answer rippled across the cabin like a wave. Vanessa wasn't here to make a statement. She was here to make a change. And everyone on board could feel it now. This wasn't the climax. It was the turning point. As the cabin door shut again and the soft hiss of the air seal returned, a new stillness spread through the first-class section, not of fear or confusion, but of quiet respect. The energy inside had shifted completely. The air felt clearer, the noise softer, and even the subtle tension that clung to every seatbelt and shoulder had begun to lift. But something else had settled in its place. Something stronger. Awareness. Vanessa remained in her seat, her back straight, her hands resting on the armrests. She no longer needed to look around. The room had already seen her, understood her, acknowledged her authority. Not because she demanded it, but because she didn't have to. Brooke, now acting as the lead for the moment, moved with more confidence. She no longer waited for approval. She no longer hesitated when speaking. Her voice was clear when she addressed passengers and calm when she confirmed the drink list. No one questioned her. No one mocked her. Not anymore. Across the aisle, Charles finally opened his laptop, but only to type a few lines of what seemed to be a reflection, then closed it again. He looked toward Vanessa and offered a small, respectful nod. She returned it, just barely. Delilah, who had earlier whispered cruel assumptions about Vanessa, now sat with her arms folded, her face blank but unsettled. Her confidence, once so loud, had been replaced by something quieter. Shame. Edward, her husband, glanced toward Vanessa more than once, but never said a word. His silence carried its own weight. At the far end of the cabin, an older woman named Margaret, who hadn't spoken since the flight began, suddenly reached into her purse and pulled out a small notepad. She scribbled a few words, tore the sheet, and quietly walked forward, placing it gently on Vanessa's tray without saying a word. Then she returned to her seat. Vanessa glanced down at it. A simple sentence, written in a shaky hand. You handled it better than I ever could. Thank you. She folded the note once, tucked it into her jacket pocket, and looked out the window. The runway stretched far ahead, framed by bright lights and the slow movement of luggage carts in the distance. But in Vanessa's mind, there was only stillness. A pause before the next moment. The intercom clicked again. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We are now ready for takeoff. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. The aircraft began to roll. As it picked up speed, so did the shift in tone. Where there had once been division, now there was reflection. Where there had been ignorance, now there was understanding, even if unspoken. As the wheels lifted from the ground, Brooke moved quietly through the aisle, stopping by Vanessa's seat with a bottle of water and a soft voice. Would you like anything else? She asked. Vanessa accepted the water, then shook her head. I'm good. Brooke smiled, genuine this time, and walked on. The plane climbed higher, cutting through the clouds with quiet precision. Passengers settled into their seats, but the usual casual ease was gone. There was no small talk, no laughter, not yet. About 20 minutes into the flight, a notification alert chimed on Vanessa's phone. She picked it up, glanced at the screen, and exhaled slowly. The airline's regional office had responded. The incident had been escalated. Statements were being collected. Rachel Miller had been suspended pending an internal review, and not just for this flight. Previous complaints had resurfaced. Vanessa placed the phone face down again and sipped her water. She wasn't surprised. She had seen this before. Officers like Rachel didn't just act once. They moved through their careers unchecked, one quiet injury after another. But not today. Today, someone stopped it. A few rows back, a teenage girl leaned toward her father. She didn't even raise her voice, she whispered. He nodded. That's what makes it powerful. Vanessa closed her eyes for a moment. She wasn't tired. She was grounded, rooted in purpose. The plane was mid-air, but she felt more solid than ever. She hadn't shouted, she hadn't cursed, she hadn't explained herself. She didn't need to. Respect isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet that breaks the cycle. And this flight, this moment was part of something bigger. Something that wouldn't land when the plane did. 35 minutes into the flight, the cabin had grown quieter than usual for a first-class section. There were no casual conversations about business deals or vacation plans. No light laughter or clinking of wine glasses. Instead, the silence was reflective, thoughtful, like everyone on board had been forced to reevaluate how they saw things, and more importantly, how they reacted to them. Vanessa sat motionless, her gaze drifting once more toward the window. The clouds rolled beneath the wings like slow-moving waves, and the golden rays of the afternoon sun bathed the sky in a soft amber glow. But her mind wasn't on the view. It was on the message that had just come through on her phone minutes earlier. Rachel's suspension was now official. A formal investigation had begun, and 3 prior incidents involving her conduct had been pulled from internal files. Vanessa wasn't surprised, but she did feel something shift inside her. Not satisfaction, not revenge, something quieter. Relief. Maybe for once the silence that usually followed injustice wouldn't return this time. In the row behind her, Charles finally cleared his throat and leaned slightly forward. "If you don't mind me saying," he began, "I think a lot of people on this flight are going to go home tonight a little different than when they boarded." Vanessa turned her head, meeting his gaze. "That's not a bad thing." "No," he agreed. "It's overdue." Across the aisle, Delilah looked up from her phone, then back down, pretending to scroll. But the color in her face had changed. Her posture was no longer upright and proud. It was smaller now, quietly uncomfortable. She said nothing, but the few sideways glances she cast toward Vanessa were no longer sharp or dismissive. They were heavy with guilt. At the front of the cabin, Brooke was speaking to one of the replacement attendants from ground staff. Her shoulders weren't hunched anymore. Her voice was firmer. She was taking charge without asking for permission, because she had finally realized she didn't need it. Vanessa noticed the shift in Brooke's behavior, but she didn't say anything. People grow when given the space to stand up on their own. Brooke was doing exactly that. A few moments later, Brooke returned to Vanessa's seat with a fresh towel and a warm expression. "I know it doesn't change what happened," she said, "but I'm sorry it took me so long to say something." Vanessa took the towel. "You did say something. You said it when it mattered." "I was scared," Brooke admitted. "I thought I'd lose my job." "You stood up anyway," Vanessa replied. "And you did the right thing. That matters more." Brooke looked down, then smiled, genuine, with a trace of emotion behind it. "You remind me of someone I used to look up to. She never raised her voice either, but when she spoke, people listened." "She sounds like someone worth remembering," Vanessa said quietly. "She was," Brooke said. "And so are you." A faint announcement came over the speakers. The pilot informed the cabin that they'd be reaching cruising altitude shortly, and meal service would begin soon. But no one seemed to care about dinner anymore. What had happened in the air held more weight than whatever came next. Near the back of first class, Margaret, the older woman who had passed Vanessa the note earlier, stood slowly. She walked forward once again, this time without the hesitation she'd shown earlier. When she reached Vanessa's row, she rested one hand lightly on the seat in front of her and spoke in a calm, steady voice. "You showed everyone something today. Not just strength, but how to hold dignity, even when someone tries to rip it from you." Vanessa met her eyes. That wasn't the first time someone tried. Margaret nodded slowly. But it might be the first time so many people saw it happen. and finally didn't look away. Behind her, several heads nodded, almost unconsciously. Vanessa didn't need a stage. She didn't need a title or a speech. She had already led, quietly, decisively, by staying seated, by not shrinking, by not giving her dignity away just to make someone else feel comfortable. The cabin had become more than a space for travelers. It was now a room full of people silently carrying the same memory, one that would stay with them far longer than the destination they were flying to. And for the first time in a long time, Vanessa felt that maybe, just maybe, that memory was going to spread further than this flight. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the aircraft settled into cruising altitude. Soft amber bulbs lit the walkway, casting a warm glow over passengers who now sat not just in comfort, but in quiet reflection. No one reached for their entertainment screens. No one asked for blankets or inquired about when dinner would be served. Instead, they sat with the silence, an unusual, reverent kind of silence that held weight. Vanessa glanced at the folded napkin in front of her and wiped her hands slowly, as if grounding herself in the physical world after everything that had just happened. But her thoughts were elsewhere, replaying every second, not for regret, but for clarity. She had acted with restraint, but not weakness. She had waited, not in fear, but in control. And in doing so, she had shifted an entire room without ever standing up. The low rumble of the engines became a steady backdrop to a scene that still felt suspended in consequence. Charles stood from his seat and stepped quietly toward the front. When he reached Vanessa's row, he stopped, not looming, not imposing, just present. "I work in public policy," he said softly. "Education reform. I've been in rooms where people speak for hours without ever saying anything real." Vanessa looked up, curious but reserved. "What you did today," he continued, "without giving a speech, without asking for attention, you created a moment more impactful than any law I've ever seen passed." "I didn't come here to make a moment," Vanessa replied. "I know," Charles said. "That's why it worked." He nodded once, then returned to his seat. His words weren't flattery, they were recognition. In the far corner of the cabin, Brooke had taken a seat on the jump seat for a moment's rest. She pulled her phone out, her thumbs hovering above the screen. After a long pause, she opened a text message draft to her mother. "You were right. Doing the right thing is scary. But it's worse not to." She didn't send it yet, but she saved it. Delilah, meanwhile, sat stiffly, hands locked in her lap, jaw tense. She had said some of the loudest things early in the flight, but now, she looked like someone who had seen her own reflection in a broken mirror. She reached for her phone again, not to scroll, but to delete something, an old post about earning your seat. She didn't even realize Vanessa had noticed. Vanessa didn't react, she didn't need to. A few rows behind, a younger couple whispered softly, "She had a badge?" "Yeah," the husband replied. "Internal affairs. She was here to observe crew behavior." "Wow," the wife murmured. "Imagine if she hadn't said anything." "She barely said anything," he answered. "And that's what makes it unforgettable." At the front of the plane, the replacement lead crew member, a man named Trevor, checked in with Brooke. "You handling things okay?" She nodded. "Better now. Just different kind of flight." He gave her a small smile. That's what happens when truth takes up space. Meanwhile, the intercom clicked again. "Ladies and gentlemen," came the captain's voice, "we've reached optimal cruising altitude. We'll resume normal service shortly. But I'd like to personally thank all of you for your patience and cooperation during today's unexpected crew adjustment." He paused. "I also want to acknowledge the importance of accountability. Every person aboard deserves respect, regardless of uniform, background, or title. That's a standard we're working to uphold with immediate effect." The message ended. It wasn't just protocol, it felt personal. A slow wave of understanding settled over the passengers again. Many of them nodded to themselves. Some looked toward Vanessa, others simply absorbed it in silence. Vanessa glanced once at the flight log that had been handed to her earlier. Her notes were brief but thorough. Her report would be submitted before landing. She had done her job. But more than that, she had protected her own dignity, and in the process restored some for everyone watching. The plane glided forward, steady and smooth. But everyone inside it had already been through something turbulent and came out more aware on the other side. And Vanessa? She was still calm, still composed, but now she carried the room without needing to lift a finger. Because sometimes, authority doesn't wear a name tag. It simply earns its place and refuses to give it up. The cabin lights shifted once more, preparing for the evening portion of the flight. Window shades were half lowered, and the soft ambient glow over each seat gave the illusion of peace. But for most passengers, peace wasn't something they felt just yet. The events from earlier hadn't faded. They had planted themselves into everyone's memory like a quiet weight that refused to lift. Meal carts began to roll slowly down the aisle. Brooke, now leading with practiced ease, moved with more confidence than she ever had on a flight before. Her voice had settled into a calm rhythm, and the passengers responded to her differently now. With eye contact, with patience, with something close to gratitude. She was no longer just the assistant who followed orders. She was the one who had stayed human when it mattered most. As she reached Vanessa's row, she didn't ask a routine question like, chicken or pasta? Instead, she stopped beside her and offered a gentle, sincere look. "Are you okay?" she asked quietly, her tone personal, not professional. Vanessa looked up from her tray. "I am. Is there anything I can do?" Vanessa thought for a moment before answering. "Keep treating people like they matter, especially when no one's watching." Brooke nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "I will." She moved on, serving the next few rows, but something about that small exchange lingered longer than any announcement or speech ever could. It wasn't just the words. It was the mutual understanding between two women who had both stood in difficult places and chosen the harder path. One to hold firm, the other to speak up. Further down the cabin, Charles had finally pulled out a small notepad. He scribbled something quickly, then tore the page and passed it discreetly to the replacement crew lead, Trevor, as he walked by. Trevor unfolded it and read the note. 4 words. "She saved your brand." He looked up toward Vanessa, then tucked the note into his pocket without a word. He didn't need to say anything. He already understood. Across the aisle, Delilah sat with her tray untouched. The meal steamed gently, but she hadn't lifted the lid. Edward sat beside her, chewing slowly, clearly sensing the change in her mood. She finally whispered, "I thought I knew what respect looked like." He looked at her, pausing his fork midair. "But I only respected people who looked like me, who acted the way I expected." Edward didn't answer. He didn't need to. Her confession was loud enough. Vanessa, unaware of the exchange, sat calmly in her seat, sipping water between small bites of her meal. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She didn't react to the whispers, the glances, or the shift in tone around her. She had nothing to prove and nothing to explain. That was the power of truth. It didn't need permission to exist. As meal service ended, Brooke quietly made her way back to the galley where Trevor stood checking notes on his tablet. "She's not just a passenger," Brooke said quietly, not looking up. "I know," Trevor replied. "Corporate called again. She's not just observing, she's one of the department's senior consultants for aviation ethics. She helped draft the very policy Rachel violated." Brooke's eyes widened. "So she knew everything." Trevor nodded. "And she chose to let it play out. She gave everyone the chance to do the right thing first." Brooke leaned against the counter. "And we didn't." Trevor placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "But you did when it counted." From the front of the cabin, the pilot appeared again, moving slowly through the aisle. When he reached Vanessa, he stopped. His voice was soft but clear. "Ms. Brooks," he said, "thank you for your patience today. I know this shouldn't have happened, and I know words can't undo what was done. But I wanted to say this personally. I'm sorry." Vanessa looked up. "You didn't create the problem, but you didn't ignore it either." The pilot nodded. humbled. If there's anything else I can do, make sure it doesn't happen to the next person, she said. He gave a short, solemn nod and walked away. That single line settled into the space like a final lesson, one meant not for applause but for accountability. In row 6, a middle-aged mother leaned toward her teenage son, whispering softly, "That's what strength looks like. Not loud, not cruel, just clear." Her son nodded, his eyes wide, his mind already shifting. And in that moment, as the plane glided high above the clouds, every passenger on board carried the same realization. They had witnessed something bigger than a confrontation. They had witnessed a shift, a quiet, irreversible shift. And it had all started with one woman, one seat, and one refusal to move. The cabin had grown darker now, not just from the descending sun, but from the stillness that lingered after truth had shaken the air. Window shades were halfway drawn. Seatbelt signs remained off, but almost no one moved. Passengers leaned into silence as though it were sacred, each one quietly unpacking the meaning behind the incident that had unfolded just feet away from them. Vanessa sat still, not out of stiffness or performance, but out of resolve. She had done this before, not just sat in a chair others didn't want her in, but held her ground while the world expected her to shrink. The difference today was that she had been seen. The silence in the cabin was not the silence of denial. It was the silence of realization. She looked out the window again. The world below stretched wide and clouded, just shadows and gold light now. But up here, things were clearer than they'd been since the wheels left the runway. From behind, Brooke quietly approached again. She wasn't holding anything. No tray, no manifest, just a nervous breath. "There's something I should tell you," she said. Vanessa looked over calmly. Brooke hesitated. This wasn't the first time Rachel did something like this. She treated others badly. Subtle stuff. Sometimes not so subtle, but no one ever said anything. Vanessa tilted her head slightly. "And now, Brooke said, almost whispering, "they're talking." In the crew chat, in the airline system, other attendants are coming forward. Some who flew with her years ago. Even one who quit because of her. Vanessa nodded once. People don't speak until someone else breaks the silence first. Brooke exhaled slowly. "You didn't just stop her. You gave everyone permission to stop being quiet." Vanessa's gaze didn't waver. That's what accountability does. It gives courage somewhere to stand. A moment later, a voice came over the intercom. This time, not the pilot. It was a woman from corporate communications. "Good evening, passengers. This is Samantha Pierce, Senior VP of Public Relations for the airline. We want to sincerely thank you for your patience and understanding today. A full review is underway regarding this afternoon's events, and leadership has already initiated new staff oversight protocols that will begin immediately." There was a pause. "While we regret what occurred, we're deeply grateful that it was brought to our attention in the right way. We will be addressing this issue internally, and more importantly, transparently." Click. The intercom went silent. A few heads turned toward Vanessa. She didn't flinch. She didn't raise her hand. But her presence radiated something more powerful than a name. She had become the story without ever asking for the spotlight. Delilah stirred again. For the past hour, she'd tried to avoid Vanessa's gaze. But now, guilt had built up past the point of comfort. Slowly, she stood and crossed the aisle. The hush of her shoes was the only sound. She stopped beside Vanessa's row and took a deep breath. "I said something about you earlier," she admitted quietly. "Before I knew anything, before I even looked." Vanessa didn't look up. She let the silence speak first. "I judged you," Delilah continued. "I thought you didn't belong up here. I assumed things because I've always gotten away with those assumptions." Now Vanessa turned her head, meeting Delilah's eyes. "And what do you see now?" Delilah's voice cracked. "Someone I couldn't have handled being for 5 minutes." Vanessa didn't smile. She didn't soften the moment. She simply nodded once. "Then learn from it." Delilah nodded, her shoulders heavy. "I will." She turned, walked back to her seat, and this time, when she sat, her head lowered, not out of shame, but out of reflection. Across the aisle, a boy no older than 12 leaned toward his father. Why was everyone so quiet when she was being yelled at? His father swallowed hard. Because sometimes people freeze when they don't know if they're supposed to care. The boy looked confused. But shouldn't they always care? Yes, his father said. They should. That was the lesson Vanessa had etched into every inch of that cabin without raising her voice, without standing up, without pointing fingers. She didn't demand change. She revealed the reasons it was necessary. Outside, the sky had begun to fade into deeper blues. The final rays of sunlight kissed the wings, and the plane soared silently forward. And inside, every passenger carried something heavier than luggage now. They carried the memory of a woman who made them rethink who gets to be seen, who gets to belong, and who has the strength to stay seated when the world tries to push them out. The hours passed in quiet waves, not rushed, not slow, just steady, like the thoughts circling every mind in that first-class cabin. The plane was high above the world, cutting through the night sky, but what had happened hours earlier still lingered like it had just taken place. It hadn't faded. If anything, it had settled deeper, into memory, into conscience. No one had returned to normal. There was no small talk about business trips or beach vacations, no casual laughter or idle debates over movie selections. Even the clink of glasses was quieter now, as if people were being careful not to disturb something sacred. Vanessa remained still. She had barely moved since the meal ended. Her tray was cleared, her seat reclined only slightly. She wasn't asleep. She didn't need rest. She needed presence. And she held it. She occupied her space without shrinking, without hardening, just existing with quiet power. Brooke, now resting in the jump seat near the galley, had barely taken her eyes off her. She wasn't watching out of curiosity anymore. It was something deeper. Respect, the kind that changes how you show up in the world, the kind that makes you want to do better without being told to. Trevor stood nearby, speaking in a low voice with another attendant from the ground team. His tone was calm, but serious. Corporate's already scheduled a review meeting for all regional staff. They're rewriting conduct protocols. They're not just suspending Rachel. They're reevaluating her entire hiring manager's role, too. The other attendant looked shocked. All because of this flight? Trevor shook his head. Number. Because of how this flight was handled. Vanessa didn't hear them, but somehow she already knew. At the back of first class, Charles typed away at his laptop, this time not for work. He was drafting something personal, an op-ed for a major paper. The title read, "The Woman Who Redefined Authority at 35,000 Feet." He paused before typing the first sentence. He didn't want to get it wrong. He didn't want to over-explain. She hadn't. A few rows behind him, Delilah sat hunched forward, fingers intertwined in her lap. She had been like that for over an hour now, head slightly down, eyes on nothing in particular. She had been rehearsing something in her mind, over and over again. Words she should have said, words she wanted to say now, but shame still sat thick on her tongue. Edward gently placed a hand on hers. "Say it," he whispered. "You've stayed quiet long enough." She nodded, but didn't move. A chime echoed through the cabin as the captain announced their beginning descent. "We'll be landing in approximately 35 minutes. Local time is 7:42 p.m., and conditions on the ground are clear." It was almost over, but no one felt like they were returning from a simple flight. Vanessa reached into the seat pocket and pulled out her notebook. It was slim, dark blue, and tucked with a folded letterhead marked Aviation Compliance and Ethics Review Board. She flipped to a fresh page and began to write, not fast, but with purpose. Each line she wrote wasn't just about Rachel. It was about the crew, about the silence from the other passengers, about the ones who stepped up, about the way respect had to be redefined, not assumed, about how change doesn't arrive in speeches. It arrives when someone decides they won't move. The pages filled slowly. And when she was done, she closed the notebook and placed it on the tray table. Brooke approached her one last time. "They're going to ask about you," she said quietly. "Everyone is. Reporters, staff, the airline, maybe even passengers." Vanessa looked up. "Let them ask." "What should we tell them?" Brooke asked genuinely. Vanessa thought for a moment, then answered softly. "Tell them I was just a passenger." Brooke's eyes softened. "You were more than that." Vanessa shook her head gently. That's the point. No one should have to be more than a passenger to be treated like a person." Brooke stood there for a moment longer, then smiled, sad and full at once. "Thank you," she said, and returned to her station. The city lights below began to flicker into view. Tiny webs of gold and white spread across the earth as the aircraft lowered its altitude. As the plane dipped, Vanessa looked out over the skyline. Peaceful, glowing, unaware of what had happened above. But for everyone on board, something had changed permanently. Respect didn't wear a badge or a blazer. It didn't arrive with titles or threaten with power. It sat quietly in seat 3A, told the truth, and waited for the world to catch up. And on that flight, it finally did. The landing was smooth, almost unnaturally so, as if even the aircraft itself had chosen to bring the flight home with more care than usual. A soft rumble swept through the cabin as wheels touched down, followed by a gentle deceleration. Seatbelt signs blinked on. Passengers remained still, unusually silent, each person waiting not just for the plane to stop, but for some invisible thread to finish tying itself into a knot inside their minds. Vanessa opened her eyes and sat upright, her movements calm and measured. She hadn't slept for even a minute. She didn't need rest. She needed clarity. And now that they were on the ground, she had it. The aircraft rolled toward a private gate, away from the usual bustle of terminals. Outside the window, a sleek black SUV idled beside the jet bridge. Two individuals in sharp gray suits stood beside it, one with a tablet in hand, the other scanning the incoming aircraft with practiced stillness. They weren't here to escort a celebrity. They weren't waiting for applause. They were there for accountability, for confirmation, for closure. Inside, passengers unbuckled their seatbelts slowly, as if rising from a sacred ceremony rather than a routine flight. Some looked at Vanessa. Some avoided her gaze out of guilt. But no one ignored her, not anymore. Delilah finally stood. She hesitated for a long moment before stepping into the aisle and walking back to Vanessa's row. Her voice was soft, almost broken. "I was wrong," she said. "Not just about you, about people, about who deserves to be here." Vanessa didn't answer right away. She looked at Delilah's eyes, no longer guarded, no longer arrogant, just raw. "You can't undo harm by just realizing it happened," Vanessa said. "But you can start by making sure it never happens again, to anyone else." Delilah nodded quickly. "I will. I promise." Vanessa didn't nod. She didn't pat her shoulder or offer polite forgiveness. She simply said, "Then keep that promise," and turned back to face forward. Charles stood behind them now, holding his briefcase loosely. "You'll probably be in tomorrow's headlines," he said with a faint, respectful smile. "Maybe even a panel show." Vanessa raised an eyebrow but didn't smile. "They'll miss the point then." He tilted his head. "And what's the point?" "That no one should have to prove their worth just to sit in a chair they paid for," she said. He gave a quiet chuckle and offered a hand. "If you ever decide to run for something, let me know." She shook his hand once. Firm, brief, no performance. "I'm not interested in running for anything. I'm interested in what happens when people stop running from truth." The seatbelt signs blinked off. Doors opened, and one by one passengers filed out. Some gave Vanessa a quiet nod. Others simply lowered their eyes in reflection as they passed. Brooke was one of the last to leave. She walked up to Vanessa, holding something in her hand, a slip of folded paper. "I printed this from our internal commendation system. You probably won't need it, but I submitted it anyway." Vanessa took the paper but didn't unfold it. "Thank you," she said. "Not for this. for standing when it counted. Brooke's eyes glistened. She didn't speak. She just walked out, shoulders straighter than when she'd first stepped onto that plane. Vanessa was the last to exit. As she stepped down the stairs and into the cool evening air, the agents by the SUV nodded to her with quiet recognition. "Everything's been processed, ma'am," one of them said. "The footage, the reports, the witness statements, the board is already moving." Vanessa nodded once. "Good. Do you need anything else from us?" the other asked. She shook her head. "Just make sure the story doesn't end when the flight does." They opened the door for her. She stepped inside the SUV, and the door closed behind her with a gentle click. As the vehicle pulled away from the aircraft, Vanessa leaned her head against the cool glass and watched the airport lights blur into long streams of gold and silver. Somewhere in that blur were faces she'd never forget. Not because of what they said, but because of what they didn't say, because of the way they looked away, because of how long they waited to care. But they did care. Eventually. And sometimes that's the victory. Not loud, not public, but real. Later that week, a news outlet ran the headline. "Flight attendant mocks black cop. Then she makes one call, shuts airline down." The story went viral. But Vanessa didn't care about that, because somewhere inside a training room, new policies were being printed. Somewhere on another flight, an attendant was thinking twice. Somewhere, a passenger who once stayed quiet would now speak up. And maybe, just maybe, someone who thought they didn't belong would stay seated. Because someone like Vanessa did. Not to make noise, but to make it impossible to ignore what silence had been hiding all along. If this story moved you, make sure to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories just like this one.